So here's our outline. I normally take a whole day to do this course, so I'm going to compress things down quite a bit, in terms of the detail, because it is a fairly complex topic, and there's, you can sort of choose your level of complexity at which you wish to go into it, and obviously, if you're developing a real live user application, you're going to have to eventually understand some of that complexity. But if it's just you hacking around, making mistakes, well, maybe you don't need to know all the details. So that's my approach anyway. So most of this we'll talk about up to this point, in fact, about being in APL and talking to Excel. And then towards the end, I've got a chapter on Excel in control, being you're sitting in Excel or you're sitting in Word or whatever, and you want to call APL as an invisible tool. And then there's actually a few other subtle variations of that with things you can do. So there's a lot of terminology or three-letter acronyms to go with this, and you could look those up. I've done some searching on Wikipedia and Microsoft sources to find out what they are. And to tell you the truth, it's not all that important to distinguish some of these things. Some people call this Olay method. Some people call it COM, office automation. It's all to me, it's all sort of the same thing. You're basically getting two processes to communicate to each other, and it just so happens that we need to follow these protocols that Microsoft has developed over the years. And this is quite old stuff now, by the way. This all started, I guess, in the 90s, perhaps. People were doing this, and Dyalog has had it for years and years. I've been doing this lecture to clients in Canada and the US and at these workshops now for several years, so it's been going on for a long time. So it's actually getting a little stale, I would say. There's nothing new going on here anymore. It's all done, it's all developed. Microsoft, of course, is focusing on other things like .NET. So really, this stuff is getting, it still works great, but there's no new stuff coming out about it from Microsoft, at least. So that's probably a good thing. You don't have to try to keep up with them anymore. The main distinctions you might want to think about are these: Are you the client or are you the server? And which application is the client and which is the server? So generally, most of you are going to be sitting in APL. That's your client. You, as the terminology goes, you're developing an APL client application, and you're talking to a server object, which is going to be perhaps Excel or Word or something like that. Okay, so it's the server thing is serving your client with information. And interrupt me by the way at any time if you've got a question. The term object-oriented is used here as well as throughout Dyalog's general philosophy here. Here, though, I think the meaning is a little bit looser than, say, the workshop this morning about object-oriented programming. Here it just means that we deal with objects, and we have to understand that they have certain characteristics, properties, methods, and events. Have any of you done much thinking about that? Dealing with objects. If I say properties and methods, do you know what I'm talking about? So a method is a verb. It's do this, do that. Property is a characteristic like color or size and shape and that sort of thing. So we do have to understand a little bit about object-oriented thinking in order to deal with the APL Excel interface and so on. So another word you'll see sometimes is class is another name for an object. Does anybody use APL 2000 products? Are we strictly all Dyalog users, by the way? Okay. I won't bother mentioning that anymore, but sometimes I give these lecture to both people who are fluent in both. Something I might touch on later towards the end of the day, ADO is a specification for dealing with databases. So you could be in APL and talk to a database, which is, for example, Access, Microsoft Access, or some of the higher structured databases. And one of the ways of doing that is a Microsoft tool called ADO, and we can actually drive that from APL. And the techniques we learn when we're dealing with Excel are very similar with ADO. It's just another object. It has properties and methods, and once we get the hang of using objects, properties, and methods, it doesn't matter what the object is anymore. DAO is like an older version of that, I think. ODBC, I believe Morton is giving a talk about that later in the conference. It's a more more generalized type of database activation for when you want to go beyond Microsoft products. Basically, it's a tool for that. So any type of SQL-based database. So those are just some acronyms. When we are in the Dyalog world, this is the terminology that Dyalog uses. So in Dyalog's case, an object called an Olay Client is the thing that enables your APL application to interact with other non-APL objects such as Excel. So you will see in a moment that when we want to invoke what we're talking about here, we create an Olay Client object. Similarly, when we're on the other side of the mirror and we want to create an APL application that another client like Excel is going to talk to, we create an Olay server object in APL. And as I mentioned, there's a couple other slight variations of these things: OCX classes, ActiveX controls, and containers. I suspect those are probably generally not necessary for most people. These things are kind of like these, but less packaging, less detail, less. They're kind of a streamlined version. That's what I think. How I think of them as the Olay client server objects. Dyalog APL, as you know, has something called what I call GUI memory. So we use these functions to manipulate GUI memory. How many of you do GUI programming in APL? You create forms and so on. How many of you do that? Okay, not too many. All right. Well, we'll have a very quick lesson in that then, because we do need to know how to create an object, how to set the properties of the object, or call the methods of the object. And these are the tools we use to do that. This is just another acronym you might see as you're traveling along in this journey, and it's just a Microsoft term that you can play around with. Does anybody brought their laptop? Are you going to be playing? Is anybody going to be following along? Doing APL and Excel? No. Okay. All right. Well, I'll do it for you then on the screen. So here's our first lesson then about these quad functions. The root object, the Dyalog APL object, which they generally call the root object, is either quote dot quote. Generally speaking, the left argument to these quad functions is the object name, and the dot is the root object. In Dyalog, it's the start of all the other objects, or the parent of all the other objects. So here I am in Dyalog APL. So quote dot quote quad WG prop list. When I type that, it lists all of the properties of the root object. And you can see the root object has a type, which probably says root, I think, or I'm not sure what it says. It has a caption, which would be that information right at the top of the screen. It has a position, 0, 0 being the top left corner probably. It has a size, a certain number of pixels, this way and this way. And then a bunch of other objects, fonts, information, a version, and so on. So if you've never seen that before, this is how you explore objects in Dyalog APL. One of those objects is called, kind of wrapped around there, but Olay controls. And the two of those objects, Olay controls and Olay servers. So what they are, in fact, are on any Windows computer, you will have certain things that you have loaded onto your computer. So you've loaded Word and Excel and so on. So those will be other objects that APL will be able to address. And the you can do a statement something like this, where you grab the Olay controls or Olay server objects. So it comes back as a list. So I'm going to say, what is the shape of CGET's? And so if I just let it spill out on the screen, you can see it's quite a mess. It's an enclosed array, and if I do it this way, it looks a little better. So somewhere in there, we can probably find the word Excel and other such things. So Microsoft Office, various Office bits and pieces there. There's a few more there. So let's do a search on the session, I guess. Something like this. And sorry, it's the next one that I'm thinking of. Olay server objects are, again, other things that have been loaded on the computer and are understood by the Windows registry. So let's grab those as well. And it's again in my case, a 5,000 by 2 array when I disclose it partly. So you could write that little bit of APL there to do a search on it. So let's do that. Or reduce XCPL. So that pulls out just the Excel objects that are loaded onto my particular computer. And it's not particularly important for us to know this. It's just if you happen to be looking for something on your computer from an APL point of view that is not Excel, and you think, oh, did I load that years ago or not, or is it in the registry somewhere? You might be able to find the actual name of it. What is important though is knowing this exact name, Excel.application or Excel.application.version number, 8 or 11 in my case. You might have different version numbers in your case. But it's actually important that we have that little string and know what it is on our computer, because that's what we are going to tell APL to make a link to in the next step. So that information on the right-hand side is Windows registry addressing information. And there's a few other, I would call them sub-objects of the Excel larger object, the chart object, and the sheet object, and so on. I'm not too sure if those are really important to know at this point. I don't recall using them. I believe there are some examples that come with Dyalog APL that address some of those, but they're not that frequently used. I just want to take a moment to mention what other reference materials I have found in the past that are very useful for this. Of course, in the Dyalog session itself, you've got the help. So help in Dyalog, and then GUI help, and from there you can learn about, for example, Olay Client or server objects. Let's go to Olay servers, for example. and it tells you a little bit about those in here, and it tells you more about this Olay Client object. That's one starting point. The other would be the Dyalog interface guide, or IG, whatever they call it now. When you purchase Dyalog APL, or when you can go to their website, in fact, and download the manuals basically that come with Dyalog, and one of them is called the interface guide. Has anybody ever looked at that one? It's a fairly complex document. This is it in PDF form here. So one of the I'll just go up to the top here. One of the chapters is on this topic. Two of the chapters, I think, are on this topic. Chapter 11, Olay Automation Client and Olay Controls. And Chapter 12, Olay Automation Server are relevant. And the third one, as I mentioned, is a sort of a subset of those. A different way of looking at things. So these, the one that I think most of you in the room will be concerned about was Chapter 11. That's the one where you're sitting in APL and talking to Excel from there. So that's a reference for you. Another one is, there was a fundamental change from Dyalog version 10 to version 11. They changed the behavior of a few of the aspects of the language with respect to what we're talking about here. So if any of you are still working in version 10, that's relevant, but I suspect most of you wouldn't be, right?
I'm using 10.
You're using 10, okay. It might be relevant to you then. You'll need to pay attention when those change. It's just some subtle differences with the way a couple of quad functions work, and the way APL interacts with objects change, but it's not a big deal. But that's in the release notes on version 11. Another source of help, and I'll get to it later. We'll show it later. But inside Excel itself, of course, if we're sitting in APL and we want to address various components of the Excel object, we need to understand the structure of that object fairly well. And you need to go to Excel's help itself to find that information typically. So I will help you, we'll go through that and explore that in a moment. I'd like to hand out my memory stick, and on my, notice you don't have your laptops, I guess. Or do you? Because I've added some extra stuff onto my key here, and it contains some other documents, and I've done a lot of searching on the web on this topic, so I've got the actual web pages on this key. So you can start, I guess. It's a zip file right on the main.
Besides, you shut down now.
Okay. And it's so I just give you that as a reference. I'll probably refer to some of those documents as we're talking here. One of them in particular is this thing called the Auto 2000 help file, and I happen to have a PDF version of it loaded here. So it looks like this. You can download it from the web, and again, it was probably written quite a while ago, but it's still, if you're a beginner in this topic, in 1999, I guess in this case, if you're a beginner in this topic, it's a reasonable starting point. And as you can see, it starts from the very basics. What is automation, and what are examples of it, and so on. And then it talks about Microsoft Access, and down here further it talks about Excel down here. So you've got a little bit of the language about dealing with the Excel object in Microsoft's own terms here. How do you and all of these little chapters here, these little sections, come with examples of Visual Basic code. So it'll be relevant for you, Rob, primarily. But even for us sitting in the APL world, we still need to know a little bit about how the Excel object hangs together, as I would say. And this is one source of that information. Of course, the Microsoft Developer Network website, do any of you browse that from time to time? It's vast, it's huge, but it does eventually usually contain what you're looking for if you can find your way to it. So again, I've pulled off some relevant pages from that in recent years, and I've stuck them on that key. But you should still be able to go there now and get stuff. And there's sort of another related thing called the Microsoft Foundation Class Library, which contains, and again, a lot of these pages, what they're really good for is grabbing snippets of code, Visual Basic code, which then you can emulate from APL. And we will show you how to do that. APL Win itself has similar documentation in Workspaces to Dyalog. Okay, so as I said earlier here, my image suddenly disappeared there. Wow, that's strange. Oh, there it is. The question is, are you sitting in APL and are you reading and writing to Excel over here, or are you sitting in Excel or something else perhaps and using APL as an agent or a client or a server rather tool that you are talking to invisibly? So most of you are up in this part. You're going to be sending perhaps reading data only from Excel over to APL, or perhaps you're going to be sending data over to Excel and then reading it back, or just writing it out to Excel as a printing mechanism or as a distribution mechanism for your APL results and so on. So there's many options like that. For those of you, for Rob and some of you later if you want to try it, you can sit in Excel and you can either, typically what you do is you send some information to Excel, a few parameters to do a calculation or something, over to APL. It does its work and it sends back a result which you then display in Excel. So there's actually some useful applications you can develop there. So if we are sitting in Excel, or sorry, in APL, like I said, we need to know a bit about the Excel object itself before we can begin. So here's a typical spreadsheet, and you have to get familiar with what I call the object-oriented structure of that spreadsheet. It is a hierarchical object. So the main object is the spreadsheet, or the Excel. That word we saw earlier, Excel.application. That's the parent object. Then within that object, you've got something called workbooks. Excel organizes its spreadsheets as what it calls workbooks, and each workbook can have one or more worksheets. So sheet 1, sheet 2, or a named sheet. These are called worksheets. So you've got a hierarchy: the application, workbooks, worksheets, and then within a worksheet you've got further levels. You've got rows and columns, and then you've got a few other useful and important areas on the spreadsheet, which are in fact sub-objects of the main object, or the next object up, and so on. So we need to keep that in mind as we are developing our APL language dialogue with Excel. And in fact, perhaps this is a good time to look at Excel itself and look at the help that comes along with that. So if I simply start Excel and go to the help right here, quite the help I want there. Let's go here, help. Table of contents. Now this is how I navigate to this. On your machine it may differ. But generally, there's this thing called the table of contents, and then in that table of contents, there's this thing called Excel Visual Basic Reference. And in that, there's this thing called the Excel Object Model. This is a useful starting point if it ever comes up. Okay, so you get a little bit of a feel for the hierarchy. You can see the application object is at the top, and everything else is a child object of that parent. Down over here we have something called a workbook object, and here we have something called a worksheet object. They aren't necessarily in the locations I would have thought they'd be. I thought a worksheet was a child of a workbook. And the color coding is important there, as it says here. The yellow, I don't know if you can see it very well on that screen, but the light color, the yellow color, is something called an object and collection, whereas the blue is something called an object only. The word collection is very important in Excel. A collection object is it's a thing that has multiple child objects. So a workbook is a collection object because you can have several workbooks within a collection, and similarly a worksheet is a collection object. And so are rows and columns. They're all what Excel considers collection objects. And when we address those objects from APL, there is a certain language or a syntax that we have to use when we're addressing so-called collection objects, because they are numbered essentially. So that is a starting point. And when you're in this diagram, what you can do is click on any sub-object and get a further detailed help for that. So up here for the workbook object now, it will list the properties of a workbook object and the methods of a workbook object. So when you click on that, you actually get a drop-down list of all the properties of the workbook object. And again, you can dig down another level into what those properties are if you don't understand them or need to learn them. Same with the methods, drop-downs, and so on. So that's a good starting point for helping us figure this all out. So you can start to see here a bit of the programming logic involved. We have a workbooks object, and that is the parent object of something called a worksheets object, and it has, for example, a method called activate. So that's the kind of logic we also use in APL itself to do our programming. In a moment, we'll see some of that from APL's point of view. So the Excel help, even though it doesn't look exactly like APL, it will get you there. It will get you a framework that you can use from APL. Okay, so that's our starting point for reference documentation. So let's just review that. Some of the key components then of the Excel spreadsheet or workbook are what you see on the you see a menu when you look at an Excel. I don't know why my images keep disappearing here. This is really annoying. Got half of it. So on the Excel interface, you've got a menu at the top, that thing, file, edit, view, etc. You've got a toolbar or two toolbars. Then you've got this area here. This particular area right here is going to be important to us. This is the thing they call the name list or name box. When you can assign a name to certain rows and columns through that. And then you've got rows and columns numbered A1, B1, etc. And down here you've got the worksheet tabs. So those are the key components that are visible to you when you're looking at an Excel spreadsheet. And we need to understand how they hang together, as I said. The things that are not so visible or not so obvious, as I said, are collection objects, or the fact that they exist and have to be addressed in a certain way, such as workbooks and worksheet objects. Collections have what are called items. So the things within a collection are as far as Excel is concerned, they're called items, item 1, item 2, and so on. So that's a terminology we need to work on. Another key property sometimes that you need to know is how many items do you have in a collection object. So there's a thing called the count property, and that tells you how many things you have. The word range is used widely in Excel, and it's rather ambiguously used. It means several different things. It's an object, it's a function, it's a collection object sometimes, and so on. So every time you see that word range, just be very aware of what your context is for using it, and hopefully the examples I have will help you with that. You can do what's called a select method or a selection, and that allows you to select certain rows and columns. There are various other methods that you might want to use, and some you certainly have to use, like open to open a spreadsheet, close to close it, add to add another worksheet, and so on. Print out is a method to actually print the spreadsheet, send it to the printer. So these are things we can all drive from the APL side of things if we want to. There are various commonly used names, such as something called a used range, or something called this workbook, or the active sheet, the active chart, and so on. These you'll see cropping up in various code segments as we go through here. In VBA, when you're on the other side and you're in Excel, you're dealing with VBA. So you are dealing with what they call macros in Excel there, and those are just part of the hidden part of the spreadsheet. Okay, so some of you if you've never touched these functions before, the quad functions, I'm going to quickly breeze through this. I would call this APL GUI programming very, very light 101. Normally you could spend several hours just learning this, but basically in APL, and the reason I want to do this is because the same principles apply to GUI program as they do to Excel programming. Really, an Excel object is just like a GUI object. It has properties and methods. So if I simply say something like this in APL, F in quotes, just a single letter named object, quad WC to create, C for create, form. Then you might have seen a little flash there, and what actually happened was it created this object. So it created a form in my Windows environment here, and you'll notice it actually has the little Dyalog APL logo right there, and it's got a standard size and shape. It happens to be right in the middle of the screen. It happens to be exactly half of the screen in height and width, and it's got default colors. By default, it has these buttons, it has a margin, and so on. All of those things I just described are properties of a form, and you can manipulate those properties by, for example, if I go back to my example here, I can first of all query. G means get, or query what is the value of the property that I ask for. So I'm going to ask for two properties here: size. I'm going to skip this one for a moment. Size and POSN. So I go back to APL. I say F quad WG for get. What is the size? Let's just do size alone. Size, it tells me, is 50/50. Well, what that means is by default, a GUI object takes up 50% of your existing screen in height and in width. So the default type of measurement is percentage of the screen. And there are other types of measurement. Another measurement would be pixels. Another measurement would be what else is there? Centimeter. I'm not sure if there's millimeters or centimeters or something. There's a couple of others. So what are these properties? In fact, you can query the names of the properties, and I sort of did that already with the root object. Quad WG prop list is the actual property name that gives you the names of the properties. So the properties of a form, because F is an object and F is a form object, are its type. And in fact, if I were to type F quad WG type, it should tell me that in fact it is a form. So you can query the caption of the form, the position of the form, the size of the form. Chord is that thing I just mentioned. Is it pixels or is it percentage of the screen? What is its state? Well, the state of a form is it's either open or closed, or it's either maximized, minimized, or normal, which means it's neither. It's in somewhere in the middle. Does it have a border? Is it active or is it not? Is it active means is the user able to interact with it? Is it in fact visible, or it could be in fact non-visible? That's an option. What are its events? Events are things like what action do you want to take when the user interacts with that form, when they click on that form, when they open it, when they close it, when they minimize it, when they resize it. Those are all events that you as the programmer may wish to deal with or not. Every one of these properties and every one of these events has a default characteristic or action or setting or whatever. So a form has a default size, default shape, position, caption, and so on. It's up to you as the programmer to change from those defaults if you wish. And then there's quite a few others that are typically the ones that you're most concerned with are right up at the front of the list here, at the top row here. Does it have scroll bars, vertical and horizontal? Can the user size it? Do you want to allow the user to resize it? Is it sizable? Is it movable? Maybe you don't even want the user to move it. You can stop them from moving it, and so on. So those are all properties. That's how we query the properties. Now, how do we actually set a property? Well, that's the next line. F quad WS caption hello world. So we use quad WS, S for set. And then the first parameter is the property name. So back here, caption was one of our properties. So we're going to set that property, and we're going to set it to hello world. I'll just say hello. Oh, sorry, yeah, WG is what you query with, S is what you set with. Thank you. So if I go back to my form, now I've changed the caption to hello, just by that little bit of code right there. So that is, in a nutshell, what you're going to do with Excel. You're going to find out what its object. The difference here is that with Excel we have way more than. We're not dealing with just one object. We're dealing with a parent object and then child objects in a hierarchy below that object. So you have to navigate your way down to the correct child object, and then you may have to query its value or property in some way, or set a certain property. So that's typically what we do from APL to Excel to get that working. So it's like I say, the principles are exactly the same as with the GUI program. You get this dialog status window when you make a mistake. It just tells you, hey, the thing you entered was an invalid property. So I'm going to tell you about that. What else have I got here? You can change the color, the background color, quad WS, the background color of the form, and colors can be expressed as a 3-integer vector, red, green, blue, from numbers 1 to 250, or 0 to 255. So let's try that. On WS B. Oh. So let's see what that looks like. Oh, sure enough. So it changed the background color. On my screen it's red, on that screen it's a pukey brown. So, all of those properties in that prop list are available to you to modify if you so choose. You can then go on to do some more sophisticated stuff with forms. You can create sub-objects. So the nomenclature for creating sub-objects, as creating them as well as reading them when we're in Excel, is you have the parent object, then a dot, and then the sub-object, child object. And then if there's a child of that child, it goes on and on. So it's object dot, child dot, child dot, child. So we do exactly the same in GUI programming as we would in Excel. We can create these objects this way. I'm just going to cut and paste this, see if that works. Probably won't. Almost. So that's going to create a something called an edit control or object as a child of my form F object, and its position is going to be indicated by the vector 10, 10. So I do that, and I go back to my object, and now what I've done is I've created this input box. This is what we call an edit control, or an edit child object. Position 10, 10 means 10% vertically from the top and 10% from the left. So 10, 10 puts it here as a starting point. And in my notes then, you can go on, you can add a button object. I won't bother doing it, but you create a button object. The caption of the button is okay in this case. The button has an event called the select object, or select event, select method, pardon me, select event, pardon me. So you're programming that event, the handling of that event with this little bit of APL. You're going to say execute quad EX F. So what happens is when I click on that OK button, my form will be expunged. It'll be erased from the GUI memory. So that's pretty drastic, but you can do it that way. So that's another, a bit of GUI logic. We also have these two tools here. Quad WN means take a parent object and tell me what the child object names are. I think you may have limited success with that with the Excel object. It sort of works when you create your own object in Excel in APL, but not always with other non-APL objects. So it's N for names, I guess, names of sub-child objects. And quad DQ is, if you've never done GUI programming before, it's how Dyalog allows you to basically, now that you've created this form object, quad DQ puts it in front of the user and waits for input. So it's a wait method. In other languages they call that the wait method. Dyalog APL calls it DQing. And now that we've seen sort of the raw form here, quad WC, quad WG, quad WS, quad WN, there's also this methodology here where you can directly assign, using the APL assignment arrow, you can assign a property as you would with any APL variable. So I can go over here and say something like f.caption. First of all, you can read what it is that way. And by the way, notice as I'm typing, I'm getting my auto-correct or auto-complete feature. So APL is actually going to that object, figuring out what its properties are, and telling me on the screen, and then allowing me to select one, and it just sort of narrows it down as I type here. So what is the caption? The f.caption, the parent object sub-object, or parent object property, pardon me. And if I want to change that, I can just go here and assign it, say goodbye, and lo and behold, it has been changed to goodbye. So that is in fact a shorthand or a much cleaner way of querying and setting object properties and methods. And to do that, it may not be apparent, but there's something up here called, it's one of the options. If you go here in your APL menu, Options, Object Syntax, if you don't have that little checkbox checked there where it says Expose GUI Properties, then this particular terminology won't work. So you have to actually set that on in your session in order to be able to do the dot, what I call the dot syntax logic there. And similarly, expose root property. If you set that one on, then that allows you to see as a programmatic thing the so-called root properties. If I could get over there and click it on. So now it's on for exposed root properties. A root property. Remember I did something back here. I said what are the properties of the root objects? So they are there. So if I just simply type in size now, I don't even have to say root anymore because I have exposed the root properties to the session. So now they're just sort of there as kind of like APL variables, but not quite. So what is the caption? Oops. So it's nothing, but if I set it to something, well, no, that's not a good one. I guess if for some reason they don't implement that. What would be another one that has any value to it? Dev caps.
We do prop list.
Pardon me?
We do prop list.
Prop list itself, yeah. Just gives me that same list again, yeah. So it's these. So I've exposed the properties of the root object directly in the session just through that little menu choice there. But generally, you don't really need to do that. You don't, and you certainly wouldn't want to do it in a live application. I'd say, like a runtime. If you're developing a runtime application for a user. Okay, moving on. So that was GUI Programming 101, and you're going to see exactly the same kind of logic applied when we come to actually call Excel itself. Another aspect of what I just talked about there, exposing properties and methods, is this. There's another quad W function, quad WX, and later in the notes I've got a whole page about that. It is a way of sort of turning on or off the behavior of that dot syntax thing again, and a few other nuances to that, subtle variations to that. Here's the main first step you will be doing if you're sitting in APL and you want to interact with an Excel spreadsheet. You create WC, an object, and you can pick any name you like here. XL will do as a two-letter acronym. The object you're going to create, the type of object, is an Olay Client object. So it may take a minute to wrap your head around that. We looked at a list of things called Olay servers. Those are the things we want to talk to, but from our point of view, we call it an Olay Client object. That happens to be how Dyalog refers to it. And the name of that object that we are going to, in fact, interact with is Excel.application. And if you recall in that list I showed you, you could add a version number after that. I think I had .11 and .8. If you have more than one Excel version installed on your computer, you can choose which version you actually link up to from APL. But generally, Excel.application is fine. And then once you do that, and then if you've used, how many of you use namespaces in Dyalog? That's pretty common. Everybody uses those, right? Yeah. You don't use it. Okay. You need to check that out. When you've done this step and you've created this Excel object inside your APL environment, you can go into that namespace. So in other words, Dyalog APL treats Excel and all these other Office applications just like it does any other namespace object, and just like GUI memory, in fact. So I can go back here and I can type bracket OBS. So F, that GUI thing that I created, is in fact a namespace, and I can say CSF, go into that namespace, and I can look at its procs. In fact, so this is another way of getting at the GUI components or the object-oriented components that you're dealing with. If you're more familiar with exploring namespaces that way, then you can use this. You can also look at the methods and the events that way. You can once you're in that namespace, so you can type. So B call. Remember, I set that. It is so you can see that the properties within that namespace are visible to me now. So I can simply type their name, and I see the value that's stored for that property. and I could set it now. So right now it's red 25500. I could set it to 02550, and lo and behold, it's now green. Red, green, blue. So this is another way of doing your testing and setup and programming and experimenting, is you go right into the namespace and play with it. Let's get started though. Let's do this Excel thing. I'm just going to get rid of this thing called F here, just so we can avoid confusion. So as you know, with any APL variable, you can say erase, and you can do the same here. You can just say erase F, and it gets rid of that GUI thing. And now it's totally gone. It's not even on my taskbar anymore. And I'm also going to close down Excel here for the moment, because I don't really want it running at the moment. Okay, so I just got a PDF and that. I'm also going to close this thing just to free up some space here. So now I'm going to run this particular line of code where I'm going to create the Olay Client object, and it's going to be an Excel object. Let's see what happens. Just watch when I hit enter. Just kind of watch this area of the screen, bottom left corner. See what it said there? It said reading properties, reading methods, etc. So what happened was APL went to Excel, that Excel object, and sort of loaded in some information from that Excel object, properties and methods. So they're now sort of loaded, as it were, into the Dyalog environment. And sure enough, if I type bracket OBS, now that Excel, lower the two letters Excel are in fact a namespace in our Dyalog environment. And so now we can do these sort of cool things. We can query the Excel object, just as we did a moment ago. So we can, from here, we can type Excel quad WG prop list. We get a fairly large list of properties for the Excel object itself, most of which you can ignore. We don't need to know anywhere near most of those. You can look at the method list. You could look at the version. What version of Excel am I actually running? So Excel, and you can do it this way too, Excel.version, if you've got your GUI objects exposed. So it comes back and says, well, it loaded version 11. Remember I had two versions there, 11 and 8? Well, it looks like it loaded version 11 by default. I believe what happens is if you install more than one version of Excel on your system, by default APL will load the most recently installed version.
That's a current version, very strange.
Pardon me?
That's a current version in the very strange.
I guess it is, yeah. And when you start Excel, that's what comes up, yeah. Yeah, that's right. But if you didn't want that version, you could have said Excel.application.version number. And that's important because now we're. How many of you are using Excel 2003 versus 2007? Which is more common? How many for 2003? Most of you are using 2007. Okay, I'm still back in 2003. The people I work for, we have some desktops that are 2007, and we have some desktops that are 2003. So you really have to sort that out because they do differ slightly. When you get down to the fine details, there are certain little differences. Well, for starters, it's no longer .xls, it's .xlsa file, right? The file type in Windows, the three letters, or now it's four letters on the end of the file, .xlsa instead of XLS. So even that matters when you're trying to find a file. Okay, visible versus not visible. So visible is a property, and well, you see right now, if I go to my taskbar, you don't see Excel there anywhere. And if I look at the bottom of the screen, I don't see Excel anywhere at the bottom of the screen either. It's not on the taskbar, but in fact, it is out there in memory somehow. So I can actually go to APL and query that property first of all. Visible. Well, maybe not. Let's just try assigning it. Oh no, I need Excel in front of it, yeah. So let's query it first. So 0 means it's not visible. So let's set it to 1. And poof, there it is, Excel. But notice that there's nothing loaded here. There's no rows and columns, there's no workbook, there's no spreadsheet, there's nothing. There's just the Excel parent object so far. So that's all we've loaded. What else can we query? Well, we can query, as I said, the main hierarchy is the Excel application, and then something called the Workbooks collection. So I'm going to, in this line, query the count. How many workbooks do I actually have currently, I guess, visible or loaded or what have you. And you can see that as I'm typing, I get a display of some object names there. And it comes back to 0. Well, you have 0 workbook objects, so therefore the count is 0. So that's pretty obvious. So just to prove that it works, sort of. So what we want to do next, I guess, is actually load a workbook. I'm going to come back to a little bit of that stuff in a moment that I just mentioned there a moment ago. Some of this stuff I've already mentioned. Let's move on a little bit here, though. Let's load a workbook, and that key that I sent around has a workbook on it called common.xls, and you can often find that it used to be with Excel 2003. It used to be installed with Excel itself as a tool that you could look at. So I'm going to go to my hard drive here and figure out where I left it. So I've got it under this folder right here. And I'm going to open that from APL, and I'm going to first figure out what the syntax is. So what I'm going to do is, we're talking about something called a method. This is a property. How many workbooks do I have? Now what I want to do is I want to open. This is a verb. It's an action that we're going to do. So we call that a method in Excel. So I'm going to invoke the open method of the workbooks object, and the argument to the open method is, of course, the path and the file name. But there's one little catch, and that is this, that whether or not that string is enclosed. Now you, working in version 10, would not enclose that string. It's a simple vector. The rest of you, in using Dyalog 11 or 12, and when you've got quad WX set to 1 or 3, or at least 3, I'm not sure about 1 now. So version 11 onwards, in other words, you need to now enclose many of the arguments. I'm not sure why they did it that way, but that's just the way it is. So let's do that. Excel.workbooks.open method, enclose, oops, and then that path, and then the file name was common.xls. So I've got a string there. It's an enclosed argument to the open method. And it took a moment there. You didn't see anything visibly happen, but if I actually toggle back to my spreadsheet, my visible version of Excel now, sure enough, there's the spreadsheet that's been loaded from APL. And it happens to have some data in rows and columns here with a bit of formatting going on and some lines and so on. It happens to have 2 worksheets. One's called Employee Info, the other called Product and Service Catalog. And that's all we know about it so far. Okay, so I'm going to go back a step now. So I've mentioned a lot of this, but I just want to make sure I cover everything. So Dyalog implements GUI memory in the namespace concept. So you can use quad or bracket CS or OBS list the namespaces. You can use bracket erase or quad EX to remove those things from APL. You can use assignment to assign the properties of a namespace object or a subobject. You can use quad NQ to invoke a method from APL. You can even use the each operator. We will see some instances where if you have multiple, say, worksheets or multiple rows and columns, you can use the each operator to apply an APL function to each of those, or call a method in some way, in an each kind of way. Upper and lower case, you've noticed in some cases I've been able to get away with upper and lower case and it didn't really matter. Well, generally speaking, it does matter, but there's a few instances where it doesn't. So, generally speaking, most things are case sensitive when you are addressing properties and methods. But there's a few exceptions. You saw that as I was typing, the autocomplete would sometimes show me the Excel properties or objects, sub-objects as I was working my way down that hierarchy. So that's a useful feature. Even if you get it wrong sometimes, you'll get back some feedback from APL, either right on the screen or in that special status window that I mentioned. And sometimes that little bit of information can help you navigate or figure out what it is you did wrong. The fact that you might try to open a file, an Excel spreadsheet, but you got the path name wrong, so APL will give you a little bit of a hint about that. Visibility is key when you're a developer. Is the Excel thing actually visible? You may be writing an application in APL. You don't even need the user that you're writing that for, or you yourself, you don't even need to see Excel, right? It could just happen all totally invisibly in the background. Or you may in fact want the user to interact with Excel. Either way is possible. Sometimes this question comes up: do I link to do I try to find a spreadsheet that's already open on the person's PC or not? And there's some information on that stick that I passed around. Can I get that back, by the way? Did it come back? Before I forget, thank you. For those of you that don't have your laptops here, just come and see me later and I'll pass it on to you. So the question sometimes, is Excel already running or not? And I believe I've included some notes or discussion about that on the stick there, and a way that you can query certain properties of Windows itself to figure that out.
So it is possible to actually communicate with them already running Excel?
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
Okay. Because we have implemented using DDE.
Yeah, DDE was a precursor to all of this. It's ancient now. Yeah, I wouldn't touch it now.
No.
Okay. Another question that comes up is related to that is this: do you want to have what's called a new instance of Excel or not? In the Windows memory logic, the logic that Microsoft uses for Windows memory, it has this notion of an instance of something. Frankly, I don't fully understand it. All I know is that you can either start Excel from APL as a new instance or an existing instance. And it's often better as a new instance. It's actually one of the, it's a property of the Olay Client. That statement, when we first got going here, this statement, one of the other parameters you can add to this statement over here is something called the instance mode, new or otherwise, new or existing, or there's a third option, I forget. So if you really want Excel to start fresh, a new instance, no confusion with existing and running tasks, no using memory that's already in use, sort of, you say instance mode new. And sometimes that sort of gets you past certain problems that come up on an overloaded PC and so on. I've seen it used in a few cases as a solution. Which Excel application? As I said, you can have multiple versions, and I mentioned that. Quad WX, later in the notes, there's a page about that, how that allows you to interact. So even if you developed your code, by the way, Rob, in version 10, and then later graduated to version 11, you could change Quad WX in version 11 and still run the same code. So it allows you that flexibility. It's kind of a backward compatibility thing. 3 Quad NQ invokes a method in an Olay control. So this is how you could create an APL application, and you could tell Excel to do things using Quad NQ. You know, it isn't a matter of typing, do this. You can programmatically tell Excel to do things using the Quad NQ tool that Dyalog already gives you. And collection objects we've talked about enough already. So let's just review then. So we have a workbooks collection object. I'm not quite sure if this actually is true. That should probably be workbooks object. It's a collection object that is a collection of all the workbooks. So you can have, from APL, you could open several spreadsheets at a time, and each one's called a workbook or an item in the workbooks collection. And they have certain properties. But in one of the child objects of a workbook is a worksheet object. So looking back at this example, this is our workbook. It's called common.xls, and these are its worksheets: employee info and product and service catalog. And they are in fact a collection because they have items and sub-objects as well. And then there are some shortcuts to that. There's something called the active workbook. That means if you have multiple workbooks open at one time, which one is the user currently focused on? And similarly, if you have multiple worksheets in a workbook, which one is the user currently focused on? And so on. So you can actually use these as programmatic shorthand names. Sheets is another sort of shorthand acronym. Sheets is a collection object. It's the worksheets inside the workbook essentially, but they refer to it as sheets in Excel. So that's part of what we need to know to get started here. So now that I've got a workbook open and it's got some worksheets, I can do a little bit more playing around with that, such as what I have here. I've opened it already, so I've done this step, and now I can do something like what is the count of the workbooks collection object? Like an APL here. So Excel.work. Well, actually, I've got it above there, don't I already? So now if I type that again, it's now 1 because I've opened one spreadsheet, or one workbook as Excel prefers to call it. And what is the properties of that? I think I did that already. The prop list. And you can see that there are several ways you can specify this. You can either type in excel.workbooks.quadwg or Excel workbooks in brackets quadwg, or you can use the .syntax excel.workbooks.proplist. Any of those I think will work. You can also assign the result of or let's say you can take that .syntax name and you can sort of bundle that name into another name this way. So you can say WBS is assigned Excel.workbooks. I think. I'm not even sure if that's correct. Let me just try that. WBS gets Excel. Okay, then we say WBS.proplist. Yeah, that works. Okay, so in other words, I'm creating my own name now that is a sub-object of the Excel object. So it allows me to do a little bit more programmatic shorthand. I don't have to keep saying Excel this, workbook this, worksheet this. I can create just one name that encapsulates that particular sub-object, which is in fact a child of many other parent objects. So that's very handy from a programming point of view. It isn't obvious here, but we've only got one workbook open. One of the syntaxes we can use is this: Excel workbooks one. We can index into that object using good old APL bracket indexing. Because it's a collection object, if I had more than one workbook open, I could have either item 1 or item 2 that way. So that's a way of doing such things. And again, I can refer to that object that way. If I had two sheets open, then I could choose 1 or 2 that way. Another way you can do it is, so Dyalog allows you many different options. So bracket 1 bracket is one way, or you can also use the term item. Because in Excel, if you look at any Visual Basic code, that's probably what you're going to see, is you're going to see object name dot item, and then an argument in parentheses, typically of 1 or 2 or something like that. So we can do the same in APL if we wish. You know, it's a bit of trial and error to try these things out. Most things work quite nicely, as intuitively as you would think. And then once we've got this thing called WBS, for example, or WB1 rather, might be our first workbook. Then WB1 has certain properties, such as its name, so that, you know, is a property of the workbook object that I happen to have open, the first item in our collection object set. Now here's another collection object, the sheets object of workbook 1. And one of the properties of the sheets collection object is how many sheets you have, or in other words, the count. And it comes back 2. Why 2? Because if I go to the actual spreadsheet, I see down here I've got employee info and I've got product service. So there are in fact 2 sheets in that workbook. So that's why I get back to number 2. So as a programmer, you're going to be given a spreadsheet. That's probably one of the first things you want to know. How many worksheets are in it, right? So there you go. There's your answer. Do you want to read just the first spreadsheet sheet in the workbook? Do you want to get all the sheets in the workbook? Those are questions as a programmer you will have to deal with. Okay, enough on that, I guess. Let's move along. So I'm going to whip through a few more of these examples then. You know, you can go back and if I gloss anything over, raise your hand, and if you want to go through later, and I'll be happy to help you out with that later. But I'm going to open another spreadsheet, just so we've got 2 spreadsheets open here. So let's get another one here. My loan. I don't want to open my loan because it's special for the second part of the talk here. That's all I have around here, I guess. Sorry, I didn't even follow my own notes here. I should have had another spreadsheet handy here. I used to have a really handy one that had some. It was supposedly from a list of terrorists from a database, which was pretty interesting. I don't know where I put it now. Okay, here it is. EPL Dyalog 2006. So I'm going to say Excel.workbooks open and close. Okay, that seems to have worked. And if I say excel.workbooks.count, it should say 2 because I've opened two workbooks now. And let's go back to my notes here for a moment. And if I wanted to know which is which, so excel.workbooks item 1 .name is common, and item 2 is terror.xls. Okay, so now I can manipulate two spreadsheets at the same time from APL. In fact, as you can see, what I've done here is this kind of thing where I've said set up some temporary names WB1 and WB2, which are in fact item 1 and item 2 of that workbook collection object, and then I can simply query WB1's name, or I can say something like this: WB1, WB2, both objects, do a quad WG on each, and get the name. So there's the use of the APL each operator to do a property lookup on two things at the same time. So we could get away with stuff like that. We can even do this in Dyalog APL. We can say both objects in parentheses dot property name, and Dyalog has its own inbuilt each orientation there, or looping mechanism, or what have you, to do that. I can also do some logic like this, where you can programmatically do a count on the number of sheets in Workbook 1, do an iota on that, use that as an index into the sheets themselves, and get their names. That's an interesting one. Let's try that. So WB1, I've already set that up. That was the first workbook. Dot sheets dot count gives me back a number. So I'm going to use that to index into the sheet names themselves, the sheets themselves, to find out their names. So iota of that. I didn't say you didn't know how many there were. I happen to know there's 2. What are their names? And it comes back and it actually pulls the name property from the sheet names. And if you do a disp of that copy, util, I think there's a function called disp, which nicely displays enclosed arrays. So it comes back as a 2-cell object because there are 2 spreadsheets in that particular workbook. So this is just good old APL programming, and we're interacting with an object that has a very complex hierarchy and this notion of properties and methods. How about the sheet itself? Let's look at that. So I want to look at what are the properties of an Excel worksheet. And again, the sheets are a collection object. Therefore, I'm using indexing to figure out which sheet I actually want to look at. Some workbooks, some spreadsheets only have one worksheet, but many have multiple worksheets. You as the programmer need to pick the right one. So, so WB1.sheets bracket 1 bracket prop list. Let's look at that first. So these lists kind of look all similar, but there are some differences. So a worksheet, some of the key things are what are its name, how many columns, I guess, does it have? This is a key property. It's something called the used range. What that means is, has anybody seen that term before in Excel? It means how many rows and how many cells has the user actually put anything into so far. So you start at A1 at the top. What's the bottom right cell? That's the so-called used range. How much has been used so far? And that's often a key property that you need to know or be able to interact with from APL, because you want to get all the data. So where does it end? Because the default is something like 256 columns and 65,000 something rows, right? You don't want all that. That's way too much, typically. What's another key property here? Well, beyond that, typically what you will be interacting with is something called the range property. And range is as I said, it's an ambiguous term, or it's a property, it's a method sometimes. It allows you to define specific rows and columns that you wish to either simply read or write to, or both. So those are probably the key properties in a worksheet object. So here's an example right away. Worksheet number 1, we specify a range setting, I guess I would call it. I'm not quite sure what to call it, frankly, a property or a specification or what. But anyway, the argument to it, if you like, is as you can see, this will be very familiar if you've ever done any sort of formulas. Anybody created formulas in Excel where you have to say from, get B1 to B5 or whatever and do something? Well, this is the same logic here. From A1 to D5, I'm specifying a rectangular array, if you like, in Excel using that specification. And notice that I have to enclose the cell or the information as an enclosed string, and hand that to the range, the word range, I'm not quite sure what to call it, as an index, essentially. And then I'm simply asking for something. First of all, it's prop list, and then we'll get to something called the value too. So let's do the first step first. So it's WB1.sheets1. And again, I could call sheets bracket 1 bracket. I could call that another object name, like S1 or something like that, if I wanted to. Dot range, and then enclose from A1 to D5. And let's look at the properties. So the properties of a range specification or range object, a selected set of rows and columns are these. And the key ones that you will maybe want to know are, well, the very key one is this, value or value to. That actually gives you the contents of the cells. And more typically, it's value to. Sometimes you need to know the formula. If in fact you are pulling a formula out of a spreadsheet, you can actually grab that as opposed to the data itself. Those two things are manipulated separately in Excel's thinking. So you may want the formula or you may want the value itself. You may want to know peculiar things about the height and the width and the row height and so on. Those are more formatting specifications. The font that's been used and so on. That's if you're kind of dissecting a report or something like that. You may want to know that. If you're who was it that might be using Word? You? No, you.
No.
Yeah. So in the case of Word, you might be wanting to know the font and the. You might not just want the raw text. You may want to be developing a report, another specification. So you want to know the details of that font and so on. So and size and shape and so on. So this is the level at which you're going to find those properties, the range property, and whatever the equivalent of that is in Word. Items. Number format is sometimes in Excel, if you're familiar at all with Excel, you know that what you see in the spreadsheet cell is not what Excel stores in memory, typically, sometimes. As a general principle, Excel might show you a number, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, but that could be rounded off. It might be, in fact, 0.6789, and Excel shows it to you as an integer. So that logic, that property of that cell is something that Excel calls the number format. How is that information displayed to the user, as opposed to how does what is really in that cell? And that is especially important for dates. When you have a column of dates in Excel or a row of dates, it's often very complex how they are displayed versus how they are stored. Excel, if you know anything about Excel, you may know that it stores dates as integers, meaning how many days since 1900-01-01. And we're up to about 42,000 something now today, I think. So a date, if you pull the raw dates from Excel, you're going to get a list of integers, 42,001, 2, 3, etc. So in Excel you don't see those integers. Like, of course, you see year, month, day with slashes or dashes or something. That's something called the number format again. How Excel displays the numbers versus how it stores them. So from APL we need to know that typically. Just be aware of it.
So can I get data that has been converted to this year hyphen, this month hyphen, instead of the raw data?
Yeah, you can get sort of anything. Well, the way it works is you ask for the information. Let's just do that. Let's get some numbers here first into our APL environment. So back here in the Excel spreadsheet, not that one, but this one, I in fact do have a couple of dates right here. I think I must have manipulated this spreadsheet to in fact put some dates here because it used to be employee names. But anyway, so I've got a couple of dates there. They look like dates, year slash, I guess it's year, month, day, 1900. In fact, I've got the date 1900-01-01, and I've got a recent date. Okay, so if I go back to APL now and ask for the contents of that spreadsheet, so it's Workbook 1, it's Sheet 1, and in fact the thing you want is called Value 2, which contains the actual numbers. Sorry, I forgot to specify a range, didn't I? I don't know my ranges here. There it is, right? So I'm getting workbook workbook 1, sheet 1, range from A1 to D5, and I'm asking finally for the value 2 property. And let's see what we get back. All right. I should have asked for one more row, just to get a couple of dates here. So it's in fact from A1 to D6.
Can you put used range instead?
Yeah, I could have put just used range. Yeah, that's another option. Let me try that then. Instead of specifying the range, you can just say the word used range, and then you get everything that's in that particular spreadsheet so far. Now, there's some interesting things to note here. Let's not go too quickly. So let's focus on this part right here first. I asked for A1 to D6, so I got a rectangular array from A to D, so that's 4 columns, and from 1 to 6, that's 6 rows. So 4 columns, 1, 2, 3, 4, and 6 rows. Here are the dates. This one was 1900. Sorry, it wasn't 1900. It was 1990, I guess, was it? Yeah, 1990-01-01. And this one was September 7 of this month. So this is how Excel expresses or stores the dates as integers. And then the rest of the information is a little more simple. The other thing that you might notice popping up here is this null, 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 null. There's these nulls. You get that back from Excel when there's nothing in the cell. So I've got empty cells up here, and when APL reads those cells, and there's an empty one there, I guess too, you get back something called quad null, and on the APL session, that appears as bracket null, the word null bracket. It's in APL we have this thing called quad NULL, which you can use as a programming tool for that. So it's a way, you know, one of the first things you do typically, you get a spread, you bring back the matrix of information from Excel. You remove all the rows that are all null. You do a little Boolean logic to say get rid of all those rows because they're useless anyway. And then you've got, you know, what you really are really after here. So that's the first. That's one of the tricks. So you got dates to deal with, the fact that they're integers. You've got the rest of these are text strings, obviously, and then you've got these nulls. So you've got a variety of information there in enclosed form, and you can use, if it helps you can use that disk function to view that in APL.
Why do I get the last row? And it's only last in place?
Well, used range does not necessarily mean that there's something in the cell. It could mean the user typed something in there and then erased it afterwards. It's still used.
Okay.
So Excel has a lot of funny little quirks like that. Yeah.
Okay.
Well, possible to specify a description for the cell? Like say this is like you had a header row. Is it possible? I don't know from the Excel side to say this is a header and to identify the cell with some sort of property, and then that way you can say this is my header row.
Yes. That is something that Excel calls a named range, and the notes will cover that. Either from Excel or from APL, you can create a named range, which is basically a range specification that has a name. And from APL, you can then refer to that name and get its value, or its number format, or its other properties. Yeah. But that, you know, what you're getting at is a very common technique. I use that all the time for you know, my clients. They get well, the first thing they want to do is they want to create Excel spreadsheets and then somehow get that data into APL. So the first thing I say to them is, okay, create a 2-column, and it's typically time series data, so you've got dates and numbers. So I tell them, okay, create a spreadsheet that has 2 columns, dates and numbers. Put the word date at the top for the dates and number at the top, or whatever value or something for the values. And then I know that I can from APL, I don't need to hard code row or column 1, column 2 as date value, because there might be more values, so sometimes it's multiples. I don't have to hard code. I tell them I'm going to use row 1 as my index into the other columns. Row 1 is a directory, in other words, a pointer. Yeah, so that's a very common technique that I use, and you know, you could adopt. Yeah.
Sometimes, you know, if you get spreadsheets, sometimes it can be different formats. They might have 2 or 3 rows as a header, or and they might sometimes put a gray, just you know, to make it look nice aesthetically. They'll put a nice gray underbar.
Yeah.
Thing. I'd like to filter that out. I wish I had some fun.
Well, the gray part.
It looks nice, but it's. I mean,
the gray part won't come back to you with this statement. All you'll get back is either numbers or text.
So it'll probably show up as null if it was a gray.
Yeah. If there's no numbers or no text, gray is a colored property.
Yeah, color.
So you'd have to query the color property to get that information, right? What we're querying here is the value property, or value 2.
Yeah. And
I'll distinguish those in a moment, by the way. But all you get back is the contents of the cell in terms of what the user typed in. All right. Back to our notes. So yeah, that's the essence of reading a spreadsheet, is figure out which workbook, which worksheet, which range you want, and then finally ask for the value 2 property. And you could you can use this shorthand called used range to get all of the information. In fact, you can query the so-called cell count, or row count, or column count of the used range. So if I say WB1.sheets1 dot used range dot rows dot count. 7 rows are in fact used in that spreadsheet, right? Okay, great. Does anyone want to take a quick break, or are we okay to just plow on here? Which?
Quick break.
Quick break? Okay, let's take a 5-10 minute break then.